Under a silver-veiled moon that peeked through a thick canopy of restless clouds, the old graveyard waited. It lay cradled between twisted, claw-like trees whose branches creaked and swayed with spectral whispers, as if gossiping about the curious souls who dared to trespass. The cemetery had a name once, etched in stone at the gates, but time and moss had long erased it. Now, locals knew it simply as Whisperwood Rest, though no one ever spoke its name without lowering their voice, as if the graveyard itself might overhear. Marley Baker was one of those souls who should have heeded the warnings. But youthful arrogance and the thirst for a thrill on Halloween night brought her here. Dressed in a hoodie and jeans, flashlight in hand, she stepped through the creaking iron gates with a grin that barely masked her apprehension. Her friends cheered her on from the other side, the dare being simple: make it to the old stone crypt at the center of the graveyard, take a photo, and return. With every step, her confidence dwindled. The air grew colder, wrapping itself around her like icy tendrils. Her flashlight illuminated lichen-covered tombstones, some so old they had cracked in half, their occupants long forgotten. The beam shook slightly in her trembling hand, and she laughed nervously, scolding herself for her jitters. It's just a graveyard, she reminded herself, filled with nothing but bones. But as she moved deeper into Whisperwood Rest, the ground felt different. Uneven patches of earth, some appearing freshly turned, disrupted her path. Marley tried not to imagine skeletal hands breaking through to drag her into the dirt. The wind carried a shiver-inducing hum, almost melodic, as if 1,000 voices hummed a lullaby only the dead could hear. Shadows danced across the crumbling angel statues that mourned eternally in their stone stillness. She reached the crypt sooner than she expected, an imposing structure draped in ivy, its stone surface cracked and weathered by time. The doorway yawned open, darkness spilling forth as if inviting her in. The stone threshold bore strange, intricate carvings, symbols she didn't recognize. Marley held her breath, snapping a quick photo as proof of her victory. But the phone camera flickered, and when she glanced at the image, her stomach twisted. A figure loomed in the photograph, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that oozed shadows. Marley spun around, her flashlight sweeping the area, but she saw nothing. The graveyard was silent, except for the whispering wind and her heartbeat thudding in her ears. She forced a laugh, her voice breaking. Just a glitch, she told herself. Just a trick of light. The crunch of leaves behind her shattered that illusion. Marley turned, her flashlight cutting a wide arc. A chill snaked down her spine as she spotted footprints trailing through the dirt, fresh and deep, leading directly to her. But no one was there. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen. Her friend's distant laughter echoed from the gates, but it sounded warped, like laughter trapped underwater. She called out to them, but her voice fell flat, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Marley stumbled back from the crypt, nearly tripping over a gravestone that bore no name. Her flashlight flickered, then steadied, but it felt weaker now, as if the darkness was fighting back. A rustling to her left made her freeze. She caught a glimpse of something moving between the tombstones, a figure draped in tattered spectral cloth. It glided, not walked, across the graveyard, a translucent form that shimmered in and out of existence. Its head turned toward her, and Marley saw its mouth open in a silent scream. Her breath caught in her throat, and panic flooded her veins. Marley bolted, her feet pounding the uneven earth, flashlight swinging wildly. She no longer cared about being brave or proving herself. She just needed to escape. But the graveyard seemed to shift, like a labyrinth rearranging itself. Every path twisted back toward the crypt, and the figures multiplied, emerging from the shadows. Some wept, tears of black ichor streaming down hollow cheeks. Others grinned, baring teeth too sharp, too jagged for anything once human. The wind carried their whispered words, a cacophony that tickled the edges of her sanity. "Stay," they murmured. "Rest. With us." The air thickened, and Marley's legs felt like lead. She stumbled to her knees, the flashlight rolling from her grasp, its beam shining into nothingness. Hands, cold and bony, brushed her ankles. She screamed, kicking wildly, her nails clawing at the dirt. The ground beneath her shifted, and with a sickening lurch it began to swallow her. The figures crowded closer, eyes glowing with a pale, unnatural light. Their whispers grew louder, almost ecstatic, as Marley was dragged down into the earth. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the open door of the crypt, and a face peering out from within, a face she recognized as her own, twisted into a macabre, silent scream. Back at the gates, her friends waited, growing restless. They called out for Marley, their laughter fading to unease, but the graveyard offered no answers, only a cold wind that made the iron gates groan as they slowly swung shut. Whisperwood Rest reclaimed its secrets, the moonlight dimming behind clouds, leaving nothing but shadows and the ghostly hum of an unending lullaby. The wind howled through the thick, gnarled trees surrounding Hollowshade Cemetery, and the air felt damp with the scent of moss and something older, something more unsettling. Unlike most graveyards, which seemed to whisper only faintly of those who rested within, Hollowshade always appeared to be holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to stir. And some nights, it did. Brian Weaver stood at the entrance of the cemetery, his flashlight trembling in his grip. His friends had dared him to retrieve a small token left at the far side of the graveyard, a foolish prank inspired by too many horror movies. The token in question was a silver locket that belonged to Amanda, Brian's best friend. She had left it there as bait for his bravery, but as Brian took his first cautious steps past the wrought iron gates, he wondered if they'd all gone too far. The gates groaned shut behind him, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "Get in, get the locket, and get out," he muttered to himself, trying to calm his racing heart. Gravel crunched underfoot as he made his way through rows of headstones, each one marking a life lost, each one feeling like a guardian to something sinister beneath. His flashlight beam cast long, warped shadows that danced and twisted with every movement. As Brian pressed forward, an odd fog began to coil around his ankles, weaving in between gravestones like the ghostly fingers of the dead. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching him from somewhere just out of view. A rustling noise startled him, and he swung the flashlight toward a cluster of dying rose bushes. But there was nothing there. "Just the wind," he whispered, his voice sounding small and foolish in the vast, unnatural quiet. Another sound followed, a low, rhythmic knocking. It came from somewhere deep within the graveyard, echoing in a way that made Brian's pulse quicken. He hesitated, then forced himself to keep moving. The locket was only a little further, near the old mausoleum where people said the ground never truly froze, even in the dead of winter. Each step felt heavier, like something was urging him to turn back, to abandon this foolhardy dare. Brian finally reached the mausoleum, an imposing stone structure that seemed to glare at him through cracked marble eyes. He spotted the locket glinting at the base of a nearby tombstone. Relief flooded through him as he knelt down to grab it, but as his fingers closed around the cool metal, he heard the knocking again. This time, it was closer, louder, and unmistakable. He straightened, heart pounding, and turned toward the mausoleum. The door, a massive slab of iron and stone, shivered and shook as if something inside was pounding on it, desperate to be let out. Brian backed away, clutching the locket so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Who's there?" he called out, immediately regretting it. The knocking stopped. Silence fell, so heavy and thick that it pressed against his ears, drowning out even the sound of his own breathing. Brian took another step backward, and the ground beneath him shifted. He stumbled, looking down to see something horrific. The earth was bubbling, like the surface of a pond disturbed by something massive just beneath. The ground split open, and a rotted hand shot out, fingers gnarled and broken. Brian screamed, tripping over a fallen headstone and landing hard on his back. The hand clawed at the air, and then another erupted from the soil, followed by the grotesque skeletal remains of a long-buried corpse. Its empty eye sockets seemed to focus on Brian, its jaw opening in a silent moan. Brian scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping the locket in his panic. He turned to run, but more hands emerged from the earth, grasping at his ankles, trying to drag him down. The mausoleum door burst open with a resounding crash, and a figure stepped out, a towering silhouette draped in a cloak of shadow, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes glowed a sickly, unnatural green, and when it spoke, the voice was deep and cold. "Why have you come here?" it intoned, the words echoing as if spoken by 1,000 tormented souls. Brian was frozen with terror, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. The figure approached, skeletal hands outstretched, and the air grew colder, almost suffocatingly so. Shadows pooled around its feet, and the fog thickened, coiling tighter around Brian's legs. He was paralyzed, the locket slipping from his grasp and clinking to the ground. Just as the shadowed figure reached for him, something broke through the fog, a flash of brilliant light. Brian's friends had grown worried and come searching for him, wielding their own flashlights. The figure recoiled, hissing like a serpent, and the grasping hands melted back into the soil. Brian collapsed, gasping as his friends rushed to his side. Amanda helped him up, her face pale and eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked, but Brian couldn't speak. He clutched the locket to his chest, eyes locked on the mausoleum where the iron door had swung shut once more. The fog began to recede, and the graveyard seemed to exhale as if content to let them go, for now. But as they hurried out of Hollowshade Cemetery, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched them leave, something waiting patiently for another foolish soul to come back and disturb its restless slumber. The village of Greymore was nestled in a valley perpetually draped in mist, the kind that clung to the skin and muffled sound. At the heart of this dreary place stood the old Merrick Cemetery, an expanse of land so ancient that even the oldest residents of Greymore whispered legends about it. They said the ground there was cursed, that the dead never truly slept, and on certain nights you could hear them calling out from beneath the soil. Elena Grayson had never been one to believe in ghost stories, but when she moved to Greymore, she couldn't resist the allure of the cemetery. As a photographer with a penchant for the eerie, she wanted to capture the whispers of history embedded in those forgotten stones. So, on one moonless night, she grabbed her camera, bundled up in her coat, and made her way to Old Merrick. The iron gate screeched as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the fog that seemed almost alive. Her breath plumed in front of her, and her footsteps crunched over brittle leaves and weathered gravel. The headstones were like jagged teeth, each inscribed with names and dates worn smooth by time. A few ancient mausoleums loomed in the darkness, their facades cracked and stained with moss, seeming to shiver under the weight of their secrets. Elena adjusted her camera and began to snap pictures. The flash lit up the fog in brief, eerie bursts, illuminating details otherwise lost in the shadows: an angel statue with one wing broken, a headstone split in two, a raven perched atop a crumbling cross. But as she moved deeper into the cemetery, the air grew colder, almost biting, and an oppressive silence descended. Even the usual night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, had disappeared. Then Elena heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like the distant beat of a drum. She paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped. She shrugged, dismissing it as a trick of her imagination, and continued her work. But just as she focused her camera on an especially ornate grave, the thumping returned, louder this time. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the ground. Her fingers went numb with fear, and she took a step back, heart hammering. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around her legs, and she could have sworn she felt the earth tremble beneath her feet. The thumping grew faster, more insistent, until she couldn't ignore it any longer. She crouched down, placing her hand against the ground near a gravestone that was so worn it was nearly unreadable. The soil pulsed as if something deep below was trying to claw its way out. Elena jumped to her feet, her camera swinging against her chest. She spun around, ready to bolt, but the fog had shifted, coiling like a living thing. Shapes began to emerge from the mist, shadowy figures shuffling forward, some dragging themselves from between tombstones, others seeming to materialize out of the very air. Their faces were pale and contorted with grief or rage, eyes sunk in hollows that leaked darkness. Some were clothed in funeral garments, decaying and trailing behind them like ghostly shrouds. A chill crept up Elena's spine as one of the figures stepped into her flashlight's beam. It was a woman, or what had once been a woman, her flesh rotted and stitched together with black vines. The specter's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and her eyes met Elena's. "You shouldn't be here," the woman rasped, her voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. Elena stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The figures were closing in, their whispers threading together like a macabre lullaby. She turned and ran, weaving between graves and statues, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The fog fought her every step, clutching at her legs and dragging at her arms. She could hear them behind her, the dead, the restless, the angry, whispering, laughing, wailing. She reached the gates and threw herself through, landing hard on the cobblestone path outside. The iron gates slammed shut behind her with a force that made her ears ring, and for a brief moment the world went still. Elena lay there, panting, too afraid to move. The fog remained thick, but she could see the figures retreating, melting back into the graveyard's shadows, their mournful eyes glowing one last time before disappearing entirely. Elena scrambled to her feet, her camera hanging by a broken strap, and she ran all the way home, her heart pounding and her mind racing. When she finally burst through her front door, she locked it behind her and sank to the floor, trying to calm herself. Later, when she reviewed the photos on her camera, her hands still shaking, she found something chilling. In nearly every shot, just on the edge of the frame, shadowy figures hovered, their eyes locked onto her, following her every move. But the final image was the worst. A close-up of a grinning, long, decayed face that whispered through the camera screen, "We'll be waiting." Elena didn't sleep that night, and she never went back to Old Merrick Cemetery again. But sometimes when the fog rolled thick through Grey Moor, she could hear that rhythmic thumping echoing faintly through the mist, as if calling out for her return. The small town of Blackridge had long been whispered about, a place where even the most fearless hunters and travelers dared not venture at night. The center of the town's unnerving reputation was Wraithfield Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard enclosed by a crumbling stone wall, tangled with ivy that seemed to writhe even without wind. The cemetery's legends were abundant, but the most chilling was about the Lantern Keeper. They said the Lantern Keeper had once been a gravedigger who went mad, his mind broken by years of tending to the graves of loved ones he never had. One cold October night, he wandered into the cemetery carrying a single lantern, vowing to never leave until he'd seen every soul laid to rest. That same night, he vanished, but the legend claimed he never truly left. People reported seeing the ghostly glow of a lantern moving through the mist, and those foolish enough to follow were never seen again. Of course, Ryan and his friends didn't believe in such stories. They were 16, invincible, and hungry for a good scare. So on Halloween night, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they decided to explore Wraithfield Cemetery and prove the legend of the Lantern Keeper was nothing more than a town tale to scare little kids. The cemetery gates were rusted and bent, opening with a mournful groan that set their nerves on edge. Ryan, leading the group, tried to ignore how wrong everything felt. The air inside Wraithfield seemed colder, heavier, like something was breathing alongside them. Their flashlights cut narrow paths through the fog that crept low over the ground, obscuring the gravestones. "All right," Ryan said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Let's find this so-called Lantern Keeper and get our picture with him." His friends laughed, but their laughter sounded thin, forced. They moved together in a tight knot, jumping at every sound, a branch snapping in the distance, the whisper of leaves rustling, a crow cawing its last cry before disappearing into the mist. Suddenly, a light appeared. It was a soft, yellow glow, swinging gently as if carried by an unseen hand. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. The Lantern Keeper? He didn't believe it, yet he couldn't look away. The light wove through the fog, moving deeper into the cemetery. "Holy crap," whispered Sam, one of Ryan's friends. "Is that?" Ryan swallowed hard, then nodded. "We have to follow it." They moved cautiously, the light seeming to dance just ahead, always a few paces beyond their reach. As they followed, the mist thickened, swallowing up the cemetery around them. Gravestones became vague, twisted shapes, and the world grew eerily silent. The light, however, never wavered. The deeper they went, the more uneasy they became. Gravestones listed at strange angles, and statues of weeping angels looked worn and distorted, their faces melted with age. The fog seemed to pulse with life, wrapping around them in a way that made their skin crawl. Then, abruptly, the light stopped, hovering over a sunken patch of ground. Ryan and his friends halted, their breaths coming out in panicked clouds. The light flickered, and Ryan's flashlight stuttered in his grip. He aimed it at the patch of ground, and his stomach lurched. The earth was freshly turned, soil loose and wet as if something had been recently buried or unearthed. A low creaking sound, like rusted hinges, echoed behind them. Ryan spun around, his flashlight beam catching a mausoleum door slowly creaking open, revealing a yawning blackness beyond. The fog oozed around it, and from the darkness a shadow stepped forward. It was tall and cloaked, the outline shifting and shimmering like a mirage. In one skeletal hand it held an old, rusted lantern, the flame inside barely illuminating the hollow sockets of its skull-like face. Ryan's friends screamed and stumbled backward, but Ryan couldn't move. The Lantern Keeper lifted its head, empty eyes locking onto him, and in a voice like grave dirt scraping against stone, it whispered, "Stay with me." The flame in the lantern flared bright, and suddenly the ground beneath them quaked. Ryan felt the earth crumble, and the freshly turned soil at his feet gave way, pulling him down. Hands, cold and rotted, grabbed at his legs, trying to drag him into the gaping maw of the grave. He fought, kicking and thrashing, but the hands were relentless, and the darkness below seemed endless. Sam and the others grabbed Ryan, yanking with all their strength, their terror giving them a desperate strength. With a final heave, they pulled him free, and the hands retreated, leaving behind only the chilling echo of a groan. The lantern keeper's flame flickered again, and the figure stepped back into the mausoleum, the door slamming shut with a sound that reverberated through the entire graveyard. The friends didn't wait. They ran, tripping over roots and headstones, never looking back until they burst out of the cemetery gates, collapsing onto the road. The fog dissipated as if it had never existed, and the night air felt warmer, more alive. They lay there, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Ryan looked down at his legs, the muddy handprints still visible on his jeans. They never spoke of that night again, but none of them dared go near Wraithfield Cemetery. And sometimes, when Ryan closed his eyes, he could still see the soft, yellow glow of the lantern keeper's light, waiting for the next soul to follow it into the mist. It was the dead of winter when rumors about the spectral train began to swirl around the town of Mill Hollow, a place so small that its only point of interest was an abandoned railway that cut through the dense forest at the edge of town. The railway had been closed for decades, its rusting tracks overgrown with frostbitten weeds and blanketed by a heavy silence that even the wildest animals refused to break. But stories persisted, told by locals huddled close in dimly lit diners and crackling campfires. They said that, on moonless nights, a ghostly train would roar through the forest, its whistle a mournful wail that sent shivers down the spine. Those who were foolish enough to get too close would hear the shriek of metal grinding on metal, see the blinding lights, and sometimes the faces of passengers staring out the fogged-up windows. Faces that were pale, empty, and forever trapped between life and death. It was the kind of story you dismissed as nonsense, but for Jacob Rivers, it was too intriguing to ignore. He had grown up in Mill Hollow and knew every path through the woods, every tale whispered to keep kids from exploring the tracks. Now 17 and restless, he craved the thrill of something dangerous and undeniable. So one cold, windless evening, he grabbed a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and his father's old camera, setting off into the woods to see if the ghost train was real. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way through the dark, his breath puffing out in pale clouds. The forest was unnaturally still, and the sky was an abyss, not a star in sight. Jacob's flashlight cut narrow beams through the skeletal trees, and the railway tracks emerged from the shadows like frozen veins stretching into the night. He followed them, each step echoing in the silence, until he found a spot where the tracks curved, bending away into blackness. He set his thermos down and readied his camera, the cold biting at his fingers even through his gloves. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Jacob began to feel foolish. The wind whispered through the trees, and he wondered if he should call it a night. But just as he began to pack up, something changed. The air thickened, carrying with it the smell of burning metal and old wet wood. A low rumble grew in the distance, vibrating up through the frozen ground. Jacob turned back toward the tracks, his heart racing. The sound grew louder, a deep, relentless roar that made his blood run cold. And then he saw it, two bright, blinding lights in the distance, cutting through the darkness like twin suns. The whistle came next, a long, mournful wail that sent a chill through his bones, and the spectral train emerged, steaming and wreathed in ghostly mist. The train was massive, an ancient iron behemoth, its cars glinting like polished obsidian, and yet there was something insubstantial about it, as if it were both there and not there. The wheels ground against the rusted tracks, sparks dancing like fireflies, but made no contact, hovering inches above the rails. Jacob's hands shook as he lifted his camera, snapping picture after picture, though he could hardly believe what he was seeing. The train slowed, steam hissing out of its boiler, and Jacob saw the windows of the passenger cars clearly. Inside, the ghostly forms of people sat, some with heads bent in sorrow, others staring straight ahead with vacant eyes. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. One figure in particular caught his attention, a woman in a tattered wedding dress, her veil trailing behind her like a ghostly shroud. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to look right at him. Jacob's blood ran cold when the train came to a full stop, and the door to one of the cars creaked open. Steam billowed out, and a voice drifted through the mist, soft and inviting. "Come aboard," it whispered, echoing through the trees. He backed away, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The woman in the wedding dress moved toward the open door, stepping out into the snow. Her feet left no prints, and her movements were slow, almost graceful. Her mouth twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only an emptiness that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Come aboard," she repeated, extending a translucent, skeletal hand toward him. "The journey never ends, you see." Jacob forced himself to move, stumbling backward as the ghostly passengers pressed their faces against the windows, watching him with expressions of hunger and longing. The train began to groan and shudder, as if growing impatient. The rumble in the ground intensified, and the air crackled with unnatural energy. "No," he choked out, his voice cracking with terror. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground, the mournful whistle chasing him through the woods. He didn't stop, not until he was well past the forest's edge, his lungs burning and his heart pounding. When he dared to look back, the forest had gone still, the tracks silent and empty, as if the spectral train had never existed. Jacob never spoke of what he'd seen that night, but his photographs told the story for him. Each one captured the ghostly train in chilling detail, the passengers frozen in their eternal sorrow. The one that haunted him most, though, was the final photo. The woman in the wedding dress, her hollow eyes meeting his through the camera lens, her hand still reaching for him. From that night on, Jacob avoided the railway, but he couldn't escape the feeling that he'd been marked. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear the echo of a distant whistle, and the smell of burning metal would waft through his window, as if the spectral train was waiting for him, ready to finish the journey he had refused to begin. It was nearly midnight when Hannah pulled up to her grandmother's old farmhouse, the headlights of her car cutting through the heavy blanket of fog that had settled over the countryside. She'd always loved this place as a child, with its sprawling fields and dense woods, but tonight it felt different. The house loomed dark and silent, its once charming facade now appearing shadowed and hollow. She shivered as she stepped out of the car, clutching her coat tighter around herself. Her grandmother had passed a few months ago, and Hannah had come to clear out the house and settle the estate. She wished she hadn't had to do it alone, but her siblings were too busy or too far away. With a sigh, she made her way up the creaking front steps and unlocked the door, bracing herself for the wave of memories that would surely follow. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the scent of dust and something else she couldn't quite place, something faintly metallic. She ignored the prickling unease and flicked on her flashlight, illuminating the familiar living room. The old grandfather clock in the corner was still, its hands frozen at 3:33, just as it had been for years. Her grandmother had always said it was broken, but Hannah knew the truth. The clock had stopped the night her grandfather had died. Setting her bag down, she made her way to the kitchen, intending to make some tea and settle her nerves. The old floorboards groaned underfoot, and the silence of the house seemed to press in around her. She filled the kettle, her back to the darkened hallway, and nearly jumped out of her skin when she heard a creaking noise. She spun around, flashlight beam sweeping over the shadows, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, though her voice wavered. The kettle began to whistle, breaking the oppressive quiet, and Hannah let out a relieved laugh. She poured the hot water into a mug and turned to head back to the living room, but as she did, she caught sight of something in the hallway mirror. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection wasn't hers. Instead, an old woman stood there, her face pale and lined with deep wrinkles, eyes wide and staring. The mug slipped from Hannah's hands and shattered on the floor. She spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The mirror showed only her own pale, frightened face. Shaking, she tried to convince herself it was a trick of light, her mind playing games in this old, haunted-feeling house. But her nerves were frayed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She gathered her courage and decided to get this over with as quickly as possible. She made her way upstairs to the bedrooms, where boxes and piles of her grandmother's belongings awaited. As she stepped onto the landing, a cold draft brushed against her neck, and she nearly dropped her flashlight when she heard the whisper. Faint, almost like a sigh. Leave. Hannah's throat went dry, and she swallowed hard, turning in a slow circle. The hallway stretched before her, lined with doors that were all closed except for one, the door to her grandmother's bedroom. It was ajar, and she could see the dim outline of the old four-poster bed. She remembered sitting on that bed as a child, listening to her grandmother's stories, some sweet, others chilling. Hannah approached the room, the whispering draft following her. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, her flashlight beam dancing over the furniture. Everything was as it had been left, the bed made, the quilt tucked neatly. But the room felt colder than the rest of the house, and the sense of unease was almost palpable. On the vanity, Hannah noticed an old wooden jewelry box, its lid slightly open. She frowned, certain she'd closed it when she was last here. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward to close it, but the moment her fingers touched the box, the whisper returned, louder now, rushing around the room like a gust of icy wind. "Get out!" Hannah stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, almost as if they were coming to life. She backed into the hallway, and the door to her grandmother's bedroom slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house. Her hands were trembling, and she dropped her flashlight, the beam spinning wildly before it settled, illuminating something at the end of the hallway. A figure stood there, half shrouded in shadow. It was the old woman from the mirror, but now she was real, solid, and her mouth was twisted into a snarl. Her eyes glinted in the darkness, and she raised one bony hand pointing directly at Hannah. Terrified, Hannah scrambled for her flashlight and ran. She stumbled down the stairs, barely keeping her balance, and threw herself toward the front door. As she reached for the handle, she felt cold fingers brush against the back of her neck, and a voice hissed in her ear. "Stay with me," she screamed, yanking the door open and bolting into the night. The fog swallowed her whole, but she didn't stop until she reached her car. She threw herself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. As she sped away, she dared one last look in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and dark, but in the upstairs window, the old woman stood watching, her face pressed to the glass, a twisted smile on her lips. Hannah never returned to the farmhouse. She sold the property as quickly as she could, and the new owners had it demolished. But some say that on foggy nights, if you drive past where the house once stood, you can see a pale face in the mist, watching, waiting, and whispering for someone to come back home. On the outskirts of Hollow Creek, a long, abandoned asylum sat at the top of a death hill, hidden away by the thick forest that had reclaimed much of its grounds. Locals avoided the area, whispering stories about the asylum's tragic past and the souls who still wandered its decaying halls. It had been closed for decades after a devastating fire that took the lives of patients and staff alike, trapping them in a nightmare of smoke and flame. But they said the fire hadn't taken everything. Some claimed the spirits of the patients never left, and that if you listened closely, you could still hear their tortured cries echoing in the dead of night. Of course, this was all the invitation a group of thrill-seeking college friends needed. On a dare, they decided to explore the asylum one autumn evening when the wind howled through the trees and leaves crunched like brittle bones underfoot. Equipped with flashlights and a couple of cameras, the group, Emma, Mike, Tara, and David, pushed open the rusted iron gates, their hinges shrieking in protest. The path leading up to the building was overgrown, brambles tugging at their clothes as they made their way toward the crumbling structure. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges, and graffiti marred the stone walls. But the air around the asylum felt heavy, as though the past had never truly faded. Emma, always the bravest of the group, stepped forward first, shining her flashlight through the yawning entrance. Dust motes swirled in the beam, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. "Welcome to Haunted Hollow," Mike joked, but his laughter was thin, brittle. They entered, their footsteps echoing through the vast, empty lobby. The reception desk stood in ruins, the walls peeling and covered in soot stains from the fire. The wind whispered through shattered windows, and somewhere in the distance a door creaked shut. The friends exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on, determined to find something to make their adventure worthwhile. They explored room after room, finding little more than rusted bed frames, crumbling furniture, and papers scattered like fallen leaves. It wasn't until they reached the old patient wing that the air grew even colder, and their laughter gave way to uneasy silence. Emma stopped in front of a door marked Ward C, its paint faded and peeling. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced a grin, nudging David. "Come on, let's see what's behind door number 1. David reluctantly pushed the door open, and they stepped into the ward. Rows of metal bed frames lined the walls, the beds still made with decaying sheets. Restraints dangled from the bedposts, frayed and stained. Tara shivered, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off an invisible chill. "Guys," she said quietly, "does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Mike rolled his eyes. "It's just an old building, Tara. Relax." But even he couldn't hide his discomfort. The air felt different here, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on their eyes. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she banged it against her palm, her frustration breaking the tense silence. "Stop," David said suddenly, his voice low. The others turned to him, and he pointed at one of the beds at the far end of the ward. A figure was sitting there, hunched over and facing away from them. It was a woman in a hospital gown, her hair long, matted, and draped over her face. The gown was stained, the fabric torn in places, and she rocked back and forth, whispering something too quiet to hear. They all froze, disbelief and fear coursing through them. No one dared move, and Emma's mouth went dry. She managed to whisper, "We should leave." The woman's whispering grew louder, a desperate, repeating mantra. "He sees me. He sees me. He sees me." Emma took a cautious step backward, and the woman stopped rocking. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Slowly, the figure's head turned, and the woman's face was revealed. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and gaping, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. She let out a high-pitched, hollow laugh at us, and the beds in the ward began to shake violently. "Run!" David shouted. They bolted from the room, their flashlights flickering as they stumbled over debris. The hallways twisted in ways that defied logic, the asylum becoming a labyrinth that shifted around them. Doors slammed shut, the echoing laughter of the eyeless woman chasing them as if it were alive, a malicious presence that wanted them lost forever. Tara tripped, and Mike pulled her to her feet, but they were separated from Emma and David. Emma screamed as the walls of the asylum seemed to close in, and shadows reached for her with clawed hands. The laughter never stopped, and the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices repeating the same thing over and over. "He sees me. He sees me." Emma and David burst through a door, finding themselves in what must have been a therapy room. A rusted wheelchair sat in the center, and in it was a shadowy figure that was more darkness than substance. Two gleaming eyes stared out from the void, locking onto them. David pulled Emma backward, but the figure in the wheelchair leaned forward, and the air grew impossibly heavy. The whispering voices were everywhere, and Emma felt her mind fraying. The figure opened its mouth, and though its voice was soft, it echoed through her entire being. Leave or stay forever. They didn't need to be told twice. Somehow, they found their way back to the entrance, bursting through the doors and into the foggy night. They didn't stop running until they were back at their car, gasping for breath and trembling uncontrollably. No one spoke on the drive back to town. The asylum loomed behind them, its broken windows like dead eyes, watching them go. In the days that followed, each of them experienced nightmares, waking up to the echo of that hollow laughter. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, as Emma tried to calm herself with music in her room, her mirror cracked down the middle, and she saw a pair of empty eye sockets staring back at her. A whisper curled through the room. "He sees you." And Emma knew, deep down, that some things never let you go. In the sleepy town of Maplewood, an ancient cemetery sprawled across the outskirts, a place so old that the headstones had weathered to crooked slabs, their inscriptions nearly worn away by time. People said it was cursed, that no one who stayed too long among the graves came back the same. Stories told of shadows that moved without light and voices that whispered secrets best left buried. But like all towns, Maplewood's youth were drawn to danger, and every Halloween, teenagers would dare each other to visit the cemetery at midnight. It was on one such Halloween night that Nate, Sarah, and Chris found themselves standing at the rusted, ivy-covered gates of Maplewood Cemetery. The air was thick with mist, and a pale, waning moon hung low in the sky, barely breaking through the cloud cover. Chris, ever the daredevil, pushed the gate open, the metal groaning like a creature waking from a long slumber. "Last chance to back out," Chris taunted, grinning at his friends. Sarah rolled her eyes, though she clutched her flashlight tightly. "Let's just get this over with. We walk to the oldest part, snap a picture, and get out." Nate stayed silent, his gaze shifting to the shadows that pooled between the gravestones. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but he'd heard the stories of people vanishing without a trace, of strange sightings and lingering nightmares. Still, he couldn't back down now, so he followed his friends into the cemetery. The path twisted and turned, leading them past crypts with ornate carvings and statues of angels that loomed like silent sentinels. The mist seemed to curl around their ankles, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Sarah shivered, the cold seeping into her bones. "It feels different here," she whispered. "Like the air's too heavy." Chris laughed, though it was forced. "It's just a bunch of old graves, nothing to worry about." They continued deeper until they reached the heart of the cemetery where the oldest graves lay. A massive oak tree stood in the center, its twisted branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Beneath the tree, a cracked and crumbling mausoleum jutted from the earth, its stone doors sealed shut by heavy iron chains. "Perfect," Chris said, pulling out his phone. "Let's take a picture and prove we made it." He raised his phone, but just as he was about to snap the photo, the wind picked up, sighing through the branches and carrying with it a faint, mournful melody. It sounded like someone singing, a soft, lilting lullaby that sent shivers racing down their spines. "What is that?" Nate asked, his voice low. The song grew louder, and they turned to see a figure standing among the graves. It was a woman in a flowing, tattered dress, her hair long and wild, covering her face. She swayed gently to the song she was humming, and as she moved, the mist around her seemed to dance, forming shapes that twisted and writhed. Sarah's flashlight flickered, and she stumbled back. "We should go. Now." But before they could move, the woman stopped singing, and the cemetery fell into a silence so complete it was suffocating. She slowly lifted her head, and though her face was shrouded by shadows, they could see her eyes, two empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Chris dropped his phone, the screen cracking on the stone path. The woman's mouth twisted into a grin, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. She pointed one bony finger at them, and her voice echoed through the cemetery, layered with 100 ghostly whispers. "Stay with me," she intoned, her voice a siren's call that sent their hearts racing with terror. The shadows around the graves began to shift, rising up and taking shape. Figures that looked like mourners, their hollow and their mouths frozen in silent screams. They drifted closer, reaching out with skeletal hands. Nate grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her backward. "Run!" They bolted, stumbling over graves and roots, the shadows closing in behind them. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, and the woman's laughter echoed all around them, a high-pitched, cruel sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Chris tripped, falling hard to the ground, and as he struggled to get up, one of the shadowy figures caught his ankle, its touch like ice. He screamed, and Nate and Sarah turned back, but the mist had thickened, obscuring everything. Chris was pulled into the darkness, his screams cut off abruptly. "No!" Sarah cried, but Nate pulled her onward, tears streaming down his face. They burst through the cemetery gates, collapsing onto the sidewalk, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The mist dissipated and the night grew quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. Chris was gone. The authorities searched the cemetery the next day, but found no trace of him. His disappearance became yet another ghost story in the long history of Maplewood Cemetery, another tale to warn others away. But Nate and Sarah knew the truth. The shadows had taken him, and the woman in the mist was real. For weeks, Nate barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that haunting lullaby and saw the woman's empty black gaze. And late at night, he swore he could hear a voice whispering through his window, calling to him from the mist. "Stay with me." The legend of Stony Creek Bridge had been whispered about for decades, a story that parents told to scare their kids and friends, retold around campfires with flashlights illuminating their faces. They called it The Lost Ones Crossing, named for the children who had gone missing there long ago, their bodies never found. People claim that on stormy nights you could hear their laughter mingling with the howling wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, you might see shadowy figures on the bridge, playing games that ended in darkness. But it was a clear night when Lily, Mark, and Ben decided to drive out there, determined to prove the stories were nothing more than ghostly fables. They'd heard enough dares at school and finally caved, looking for a thrill. The road leading to the bridge was narrow and lined with dense trees, the headlights barely cutting through the suffocating blackness. Mark drove, his hands tight on the wheel as he tried to play it cool. "I don't know, guys," Ben said from the back seat. "Feels kind of wrong, doesn't it?" Lily, sitting shotgun, rolled her eyes. "Come on. We've come this far. It's just a dumb bridge. We'll take a few pictures, laugh about it, and go home." Mark remained silent, but he pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder by the bridge, the tires crunching loudly. They all got out, and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept up their spines. The bridge stretched out over the wide creek, its wooden planks worn and sagging in places. An old, rusted lantern hung from a post, swaying gently in the breeze, though there was no wind to make it move. "Okay, let's do this," Lily said, her voice a touch too loud, as if she were trying to banish the darkness with her bravado. They stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking beneath them. The air felt heavier, and the scent of water and rotting leaves clung to everything. Mark pulled out his phone to record, panning it around. "See? Just a bridge." But the moment he said that, the lantern's rusted chain snapped and the lantern fell, shattering against the wooden planks. They all jumped and Ben cursed, his eyes wide. "Did you see that? It just fell." Before anyone could respond, the sound of children's laughter echoed from beneath the bridge. It was light, playful, and chillingly out of place. Lily spun around, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" The laughter grew louder, and something splashed in the creek below. Mark leaned over the railing, his hands trembling. "I don't see anything," he whispered. The laughter stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the bridge. Then, slowly, a fog began to roll in, creeping over the water and snaking up onto the bridge itself. The temperature plummeted, and Lily shivered, her breath coming out in white puffs. "We need to leave," Ben said, backing away. But before they could move, the fog thickened, swirling around them. Shadows formed within it, small figures with indistinct features, like children made of mist and darkness. One of the figures stepped forward, and though its face was blurred, its eyes were bright, almost glowing. It tilted its head as if curious, and reached out a hand to Lily. "Play with us," the shadow whispered, its voice a blend of a child's innocence and something far more sinister. Lily stumbled backward, nearly falling. No, we're leaving." The shadow children didn't seem to like that answer. The laughter returned, harsher now, echoing in a way that made the ground seem to vibrate. The bridge began to shake, and Mark dropped his phone, which skidded across the planks and fell into the creek below. The shadow children advanced, their forms shifting and flickering like candle flames. Mark grabbed Lily and Ben. "Run!" They sprinted back to the car, the bridge shuddering beneath their feet. The shadows chased them, and the laughter grew louder, more deranged. The car door handles were slick with dew, and Mark fumbled with his keys before finally getting them inside. He gunned the engine, and the tires spun before catching, the car lurching forward. As they sped away, Ben turned in his seat, looking out the back window. The shadow children had stopped at the edge of the bridge, their forms flickering before vanishing. But one shadow remained, a taller figure, shrouded in darkness, standing perfectly still. Its head tilted, as if watching them leave. And just before the bridge disappeared from view, Ben saw the figure raise a hand and wave. They drove back to town in terrified silence, only speaking once they reached the safety of Lily's driveway. They swore never to go back to Stony Creek Bridge, and they kept that promise. But the nightmares came anyway, dreams filled with echoing laughter and shadowy figures that whispered invitations to play. 1 week later, Mark woke in the middle of the night, his bedroom shrouded in darkness. His phone buzzed on his nightstand, a new message from an unknown number. The text simply read, "Come play with us." Mark's blood ran cold, and a sound drifted in through his open window, the soft, innocent laughter of children, echoing from somewhere deep in the night. There's a forest near the town of Ravenswood that no one dared to enter after sunset, a dense expanse called Whispering Pines. The trees there grew close together, their branches entwined like the fingers of old lovers, and the forest floor was thick with fallen pine needles. A legend claimed that the forest was cursed, a place where those who went missing never returned. People spoke of an ancient evil, a presence that lurked in the shadows, and of voices that whispered your deepest fears, leading you deeper into the darkness. But legends, of course, often tempt those who want to prove their bravery. On a particularly chilly autumn evening, a group of friends, Sophie, Alex, and Kevin, decided to venture into Whispering Pines. They'd all heard the stories but dismissed them as campfire tales, fabricated to keep children from straying too far into the woods. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they crossed the threshold of the forest as the last rays of sunlight bled out of the sky. The deeper they ventured, the quieter it grew. The air was heavy, muffling even their whispers. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional creak of a branch, as if the forest itself were sighing. Kevin tried to lighten the mood. "Scared yet?" he teased, but his voice lacked confidence, and Sophie shot him a nervous glance. "It's just really dark," she muttered, gripping her flashlight tighter. The beam cut through the blackness but revealed only more trees, more shadows. Alex, who was leading the way, stopped suddenly. "Wait," he said, his voice hushed. "Do you hear that?" They fell silent, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, just the sound of their own breaths. But then they heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. It was almost like a child's voice carrying through the trees, singing a lullaby in a language none of them recognized. Sophie's skin prickled and she shivered. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. Kevin tried to laugh, but it came out strangled. "Probably some animal, right?" The whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if it were circling them. The words were still unintelligible, but the tone was sickly sweet, a gentle croon that made their hearts pound with unease. The friends exchanged a look, each hoping someone else would suggest leaving. "Maybe we should turn back," Sophie finally said, her voice tight. But before they could agree, the whispering stopped, and the forest became deathly still. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Okay, let's head back." He turned to retrace their steps, but the path they'd taken was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted, rearranging themselves into a maze. Kevin's eyes widened, panic setting in. "Where's the trail?" he demanded. They spun around, searching for any familiar landmarks, but everything looked the same. The trees closed in, and the darkness seemed to thicken, like a living thing. Then, just as suddenly, the whispering returned, louder now and much closer. "Help me," a voice called, soft and childlike, but full of sadness. The sound came from behind a cluster of trees. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "No, we can't. It's a trick." But Kevin was already moving toward the voice, as if pulled by an invisible thread. "What if it's someone who needs help?" he argued, his voice distant. "Kevin, stop!" Alex shouted, but Kevin didn't listen. He pushed through the undergrowth, disappearing into the shadows. Sophie and Alex chased after him, their flashlights bobbing wildly, but they couldn't keep up. Kevin's light vanished, and so did his footsteps. "Kevin!" Alex yelled, his voice cracking, but there was no answer. The whispering surrounded them now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. "This way, come find us!" They sounded innocent, almost friendly, but there was an edge of something darker, something hungry. "Kevin!" Sophie sobbed, but the forest only echoed her cries. They stumbled through the woods, desperate to find their friend, but it was like running in circles. The whispering never ceased, and the darkness pressed down on them, suffocating and cold. Then the voices changed, shifting from soft invitations to mocking laughter, cruel and inhuman. Alex grabbed Sophie's arm. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." But as they tried to find a way out, Sophie noticed something strange. Her flashlight illuminated carvings on the trees, faces etched into the bark. The faces were twisted, mouths open in eternal screams, eyes wide with terror. One of them looked disturbingly familiar. That looks like Kevin," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. Alex's face drained of color. "What's happening?" he whispered, terror gripping him. Before they could react, a shadow moved through the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, and its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. It didn't walk, it glided, and the whispering voices seemed to pour from its very being. "Welcome," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The word was a chorus, echoing through the forest. "Stay with us. Forever." Alex and Sophie turned and ran, but the forest felt endless. The whispering chased them, and the shadow creature followed, always just out of reach, but never letting them escape. Sophie tripped, falling hard, and Alex tried to help her up, but the moment his hand touched hers, the ground beneath them gave way. They tumbled into darkness, and the last thing they heard was the mocking laughter of the whispering voices, welcoming them into the void. Back in Ravenswood, no one ever found Alex, Sophie, or Kevin. Search parties scoured Whispering Pines, but the forest gave up no secrets. Another legend was added to the town's lore, and parents warned their children never to enter the woods after dark. But sometimes, late at night, people walking near the forest's edge swore they could hear voices, a child's laughter, a boy calling for help, and whispers that promised, "This way, come find us."